I'm going to briefly introduce Michael Barnard to you. He was kind enough to pre-record the session because we had never done a two-way thing live and also stream it, and it seemed safer to do it that way. Michael Barnard is the founder and chief strategist of The Future is Electric, abbreviated as TFIE. They work toward pragmatic optimism and a better future built on technology, good business practices, and intelligent policy. Michael has held leadership positions in Asia and North and South America and worked for several think tanks. He publishes regularly on strategy, technology, and policy, including for a very general audience at Clean Technica and via podcast. I also discovered him reading voraciously on Quora, where he voraciously answered questions on energy. And I was really impressed by his evidence-based approach. For example, what really caught my eye were how he investigated claims about magically fantastic wind power designs that then again didn't really pan out, but still lingered on the internet. And I thought he had a very good method. He actually went in, read all the material about it, applied physics, because there are boundary conditions that you can't just wish away. And that was what drew me to him, and I followed him on Quora. And most impressed was I by what is basically the impetus for tonight's keynote. He was on a podcast with another hero of mine, Bill Nussey, who published a wonderful book last December, Freeing Energy, where he makes the case that local energy, such as provided by microgrids and other such technologies, might eat into the big distribution grid and bring us to climate solutions faster than we perhaps think. Michael's talk is about 30 minutes long, and after that we're somewhat confident that we'll be able to take your questions and have him answer them. So without further ado.
Thanks, Martin. Glad to be here. Hi, everybody. Sorry this isn't live, but we've chosen not to tempt fate with the Zoom gods. And flying 1,000 miles for a 40-minute chat didn't seem like a good use of my carbon budget. With luck, questions will be possible, but if not, feel free to get them to the organizers and I'll respond in text. So, I used to play a lot of Texas Hold'em poker, and at the beginning of the year, Bill Nussey of Freeing Energy asked me how I would bet $1 billion on the energy transformation for climate action for his podcast. And since then, a global multi-billion-dollar infrastructure investment fund asked for an extension of that concept for a private briefing. So I've sorted my short list of climate actions that will work from biggest to smallest cost. But that isn't necessarily sorted by the biggest impact. Each chunk has a slowly growing thermometer of cost, so keep your eyes on how it changes. This is the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory Energy Flow Sankey diagram. The boxes on the right, rejected energy and energy services, are important to understand. We don't have to replace all the primary energy we use today because we throw away 2/3 of it, mostly in the form of waste heat from burning fossil fuels. We just need to replace the energy services. And direct use of renewable energy for electrical energy services is very high efficiency. So we need to convert all energy services to work directly from electricity instead of burning fuels if at all possible. Transportation, industry, and agriculture, all of it. All gas appliances must go. All road transport will be electric. Most trains and planes will be electric, although I only project electric intercontinental aviation to be viable by 2060 or so. On the train side, China has built enough high-speed electrified rail to wrap around the equator since 2007, and it's still expanding its network into neighboring countries. And that high-speed rail includes 80-mile-per-hour freight as well as 220-mile-per-hour passenger trains. All the biofuels manufactured and consumed today need to be reserved for hard-to-electrify transportation, not wasted on ground transport. Virtually all heat needs to come from electricity, with all low-grade heat moved from place to place with heat pumps. We already have high-quality electric heat sources, like the electric arc furnaces used in electric steel mini mills, that are fit for purpose for most industrial requirements. This is a core part of the modeling work of Mark Z. Jacobson and his team of engineers and economists at Stanford. When I speak to him, we share the perspective that primary energy demand will shrink, not grow, but energy services supplied by electricity will increase substantially. It's key to their 2050 scenario of 100% renewables and often missed or downplayed by other analysts, including Vaclav Smil, Bill Gates' favorite author on the subject. All other forms of generation, with the exception of nuclear, were overbuilt and run under their capacity factors. So we'll do the same with wind and solar. U.S. coal, for example, was running under 50% capacity factor in 2021, a continued reduction year over year. And renewables are cheap and becoming cheaper, so that will not be that expensive. There are still hydro sites that are low carbon and viable in the north and desert areas that should be exploited, just as China turned on the Three Gorges Dam in 2012, making it the biggest in the world by one measure. After wind and water and solar, there'll be some infill geothermal and tidal, but they won't be doing the heavy lifting. I've calculated that only $3 trillion of renewables would provide all primary energy for everything the USA does today. And Mark Z. Jacobson's 100% renewables by 2050 material makes the same calculations. 8% or so of global CO2 emissions come from making Portland cement. It's absolutely critical to urban densification and industry, so we won't stop making it, even though we have to reduce our use of it as much as is viable through technologies like mass timber. But it's a huge source of CO2, about half from the energy and half from CO2 that bakes off the limestone as it's turned into quicklime. Electrifying that energy flow helps, but capturing the CO2 is one of the few places where mechanical carbon capture might make sense, and more on that later. Steel will mostly be fixed by aggressively turning internal combustion vehicles, refineries, pipelines, and other fossil fuel infrastructure into new steel using electric mini mills. 70% of North American steel is already made this way. With the increase of cost of shipping, a lot more steel will be manufactured close to extraction using renewable energy, either with direct reduction using electricity or using hydrogen. And since the fossil fuel industry is one of the major consumers of new steel globally, demand will not be rising as much as many assume. We have to transform high-emitting industrial processes like bicarbonate manufacturing too. Every box of baking soda comes with the equivalent of 3 boxes of equal mass of carbon dioxide if it's manufactured using the 150-year-old solvate process. There's a lot of work in industrial processes, and much of it has barely started. While storage of electricity is an overstated concern, given overbuilding of renewables and continent-scale grids, 3,600 gigawatts or so of power is still required. A closed-loop, off-river pumped hydro is the largest form of grid storage by far today, and one we've been building since 1907, mostly to give coal and nuclear plants something to do at night, and to balance their inflexible generation. And it's by far the largest form of grid storage under construction, with about 60 gigawatt of power capacity of shovels in the ground right now, and about 5 gigawatts turned on in the last quarter alone. I'm dealing with a trio of Scottish sites with 2.5 gigawatts of power and 60 gigawatt hours of energy capacity, one of which is shovel-ready and 2 of which will be in under a year. That trio alone dwarfs global grid storage battery construction. The resource potential for good pumped hydro is about 100 times greater than the need. It is efficient, and it uses stable, well-known technologies. I like to say it's the biggest untold story of grid storage. Shifting existing hydroelectric dams to be passive, on-demand storage as opposed to baseload will also be useful. Scandinavia is already investing in upgrades to turbines and power electronics that make that viable, and it's a clear path forward for most dams. Don't mistake the Southwest USA's problems with global ones, but obviously shifts in precipitation patterns do have impacts. Fast response in-day grid storage can be provided by existing cell-based batteries, as Tesla has proven in California, as Australia, but energy and power are tightly coupled in that form factor. Cell-based batteries won't bridge past shifting electricity 6 hours into the future, so they're a small part of the future. A big part, big small part, but a small part. Redox flow batteries, on the other hand, bridge lithium-ion and pumped hydro because they decouple energy and power and can be built anywhere. Hence, they're being the second largest form of storage in my projections. But we'll also have about 20 terawatt hours of batteries on wheels in U.S. light vehicles alone, suitable for demand management to reduce peak demand, but also to soak up excess generation and a little bit of vehicle-to-grid electricity. I don't think that's a big one. Now, we've cut down about half of the 6 trillion trees that used to grow on Earth. Planting 1 trillion trees, about a third of the ones we've already cut down, would buy us a lot of time, as they sucked about a ton of CO2 from the atmosphere per tree over 40 years. As we move subsistence farmers off the land, a lot of that land will be suitable for reforestation and afforestation. 1 trillion trees is only 8% of global landmass by my napkin sketch calculation. Among other things, we're getting land back when we eliminate fossil fuel infrastructure, including strip mines, something that takes up close to 1% of global landmass today. And there's an agricultural land bonus as well. Now, China is leading the way in this. Having cut down a lot of their trees in past misadventures, they've been planting new ones at a massive scale since 1990. They've covered an area larger than the size of France with new trees, about 40 billion of them so far. But that's only 4% of the trillion requirement. Planting 100 million trees a week is a globally achievable number, especially with new drone planting solutions like drone seeds, swarms of 520-pound, 8-foot diameter heavy lift drones planting 60 pounds of seedlings in a run. That will still take a couple of hundred years to plant 1 trillion trees, but we'll be gaining benefits of carbon drawdown, clean air, and sustainable building materials fairly quickly. And tree roots interact with underground mushroom root networks, which have a protein called glomalin, which binds with carbon for long-term soil sequestration. If we leave the roots alone, we do get permanent carbon sequestration. Now, that 1 trillion trees are net new trees, by the way. We have to stop clear cutting. Sustainable electrified forestry is critical, and mass timber construction from it will displace a lot of concrete in buildings. We already have continent-scale grids in place. North Sea wind flows to southern Europe. James Bay electricity flows down into New York. Great Plains wind flows to the coasts. The 5 grid areas of the USA already have significant interconnections, even though Texas remains fairly isolationist. And we have to build more. High voltage direct current transmission, HVDC, became much more viable with high-speed circuit breakers in 2011. And is essential technology for long-distance, low-loss electrical transmission. It can replace some AC transmission during upgrades and be buried along existing right-of-ways if necessary. And HVDC only loses 3.5% or less of energy over 600 miles. Now, China is building an Asian supergrid with HVDC, linking all of its neighboring countries into one renewable electricity sharing behemoth, with half the people on Earth in it. The head of China's national grid proposed a transpolar HVDC grid back in 2016 to link all northern continents. Sunshine and wind from Mongolia could power Europe or North America in the future. There are projects proposed that would bring firmed electricity from wind, solar, and storage in Morocco up to the UK, and from Australia up into Singapore via submerged HVDC cables. There's a great project designed and looking for funding called MedGrid, which would link Northern Africa to Europe at 3 points across the Mediterranean, allowing more countries to share more renewable electricity. Biden's plan was an HVD backbone through Central America to South America. That would have been a great economic boom for Central America, giving jobs to people currently trekking north to the southern border of the United States after climate change has disrupted their old livelihoods. But that didn't sell well domestically, so he pivoted to Sanders' plan to put an HVDC mesh along federal rights-of-way. That's actually moving forward. if sluggishly, with the northeastern USA mesh and connections to offshore wind and planning. I spoke with Jigar Shah, who heads the U.S. Department of Energy's Loans Office a few weeks ago about this, and there are billions available for grid transmission. But in the USA, it's tough due to the devolution of authority to say no down so far, often to counties or even individuals. Anyone who's read Michael Scully's Superconnector is familiar with U.S. pain points. But as I like to say, don't assume the U.S. experience is shared globally. Hydrogen for energy hype is high right now, but the molecule is better understood as a climate change problem, not a climate change solution. We use about 120 million tons of hydrogen annually today, with CO2 emissions of about 1 billion tons per year. It's as big a climate change problem as all of global aviation right now. But there's some good news. The biggest consumer of hydrogen, about 50 million tons of it in pure form, is oil refineries, which use it to reduce sulfur in gasoline, diesel, kerosene, and other petroleum products. That's mostly going away by 2100. And that's starting soon, with major firms like McKinsey and Equinor projecting peak oil demand later this decade. High sulfur crude, like Alberta's product, will be first off the market. The second biggest is in nitrogen-based fertilizers, about 33 million tons a year, and that has to diminish a lot as well. 85% of fertilizers are currently made with ammonia from fossil hydrogen, with upstream methane leaks and steam reformation emissions adding up to about 12 times the mass of CO2e as the hydrogen that's produced. And when we use fertilizer on fields, that's another problem which I'll cover in the next slide. The remainder of current demand must be displaced by green hydrogen. And there is little room for wasting energy by turning renewable electricity into an inefficient and ineffective fuel. Hydrogen for energy is almost entirely a dead end. We'd have to build 3 times as much renewable generation if we go down this path to replace fossil fuels with some other molecule. It's energetic vandalism. Now, high tillage agriculture is a process that keeps releasing carbon captured by plants back into the atmosphere. We slice up the roots and mushroom mats and expose them to the air, and they decompose rapidly when exposed to oxygen to turn back into CO2. And high tillage agriculture comes with that fertilizer problem. Ammonia and ammonia-based fertilizers made from fossil fuels are the primary source of nitrogen today. And when ammonia is put on fields, it goes through a couple of chemical transformations, and a bunch of it ends up as nitrous oxide, with a global warming potential 265 times that of CO2. Every ton of fertilizer put on fields comes with around 7 tons of CO2e from upstream methane emissions and hydrogen manufacturing, and another 3 tons of CO2e from nitrous oxides. That's a big climate problem, but we will still need calories for the billions of people on Earth. Switching to low-carb tillage farming would buy us a lot of time, as the CO2 captured by farmland would stay in the soil a lot longer, and some of it would be permanently sequestered. The mushroom network protein glomalin would be grabbing carbon molecules and shuffling them into long-term sequestration. And low-tillage agriculture requires less fertilizer. Precision agriculture is another big wedge, and it's cheap. All it requires is GPS and computers, things which have plummeted in price, and some new farm equipment. Poke a hole in a specific place, drop a seed in, squirt it with just the right amount of fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides, and don't waste a lot of any of those. So that's another big reduction in fertilizer demand, and a bonus of a lot less pesticides and herbicides running off of fields. Then there's agrogenetics. I spoke to the CEO and founder of Pivot Bio, a PhD geneticist named Karsten Temme last year. Pivot Bio is one of many firms in this space. He and his co-founder realized they could suppress nitrogen sensors in existing oil microbes that are symbiotic with plants today, using plant sugars to power nitrogen fixing from the air. When we put fertilizers on fields today, the microbes are lazy, as life is, and stop bothering to produce nitrogen themselves. But suppressing the sensor means they keep on doing it. When I spoke to him, they'd already had 1 million acres of U.S. corn under their product, seeing a 25% fertilizer reduction. And it's the equivalent of baker's yeast, by the way. It's easy to make. They're targeting 100% by 2030, which I think is aggressive, but I'm not going to dismiss it. The last wedge is moving subsistence farmers off the land and intensifying agriculture under agribusinesses. Subsistence farmers are calorie strippers, as anyone who has looked at the infamous picture of the border of Haiti and the Dominican Republic knows. Moving them to productive and more profitable work, shifting the arable land into high-efficiency modern agriculture, and moving the semi-arable and non-arable land into switchgrass and trees is a win. The combination of low-tillage agriculture, precision agriculture, agrogenetics, and eliminating subsistence farming will see plummeting CO2 emissions from agriculture globally. Now, the simplest way to get a lot of people and industries to shift away from emitting lots of CO2 is to make it expensive. That's what carbon pricing does. It doesn't cost much in dollars, but it can be expensive in terms of political capital. The Australian Labor Party that brought in carbon pricing lost power in large part due to a campaign against it. However, Canada has run 3 elections since 2015 where carbon price has been a campaign trail issue, and carbon pricing has won each time. It was high risk in a Western democracy to campaign on a carbon price a year after Australia had shown the challenges, but it was a high-risk, high-reward political cycle. I had high hopes for the U.S. carbon border adjustment in imports, as it included the same same carbon price on domestic U.S. goods, but at least right now, Manchin appears set against it. I hold out hope that it will make it into U.S. policy eventually, as that will sweep in all of North America. Europe is moving rapidly towards a carbon border adjustment to go along with their emissions trading system. China's new emissions trading system market is already 3 times the size of the European Union's. The trends are positive. It's just policy and regulation dollars, not massive infrastructure. Getting rid of coal is already happening, but it's still by far the largest single source of CO2 emissions. It's not just climate change. As I estimate, that each coal plant kills almost 80 people a year and makes hundreds or thousands ill. Aggressive actions to eliminate burning coal are needed. Ontario and Canada was a leader on this, and it remains the single biggest emissions reduction of any policy in the country. 37 million tons of CO2 were eliminated every year. And it's actually the law that coal generation can't come back. The administration that followed did a bunch of deeply stupid things about electricity, but they are now able to coast on their predecessors and federal policies. For gas, the question is how few gas plants can we build? How many of them can we run on biologically sourced methane? And how fast can we shut them down entirely? We'll likely be burning some gas for electricity still in 2080, but the remaining plants will be running at 1% of their capacity. A good question is how we make that economically, and there are answers. Some countries have effectively nationalized these generation assets to allow the public purse to absorb the higher cost of generation that lower utilization brings without the capacity leaving the market. Denmark has a policy like that to backstop its massive wind generation, which often exceeds 140% of demand. Exploration, extraction, and use subsidies. Just cut them out. The G7 and G20 have committed to eliminating subsidies, but progress has been slow. The World Bank continues to finance coal, oil, and gas projects despite commitments to ending that. The U.S. alone spends tens of billions of dollars annually on subsidies of various kinds for the fossil fuel industry, and hasn't done a thing about it since committing to eliminate them in 2009. That's part of why I look with some skepticism on Biden's pledge to eliminate them, as he was VP in 2009 when the pledge was made, and for 7 more years without progress. Many of them are in the permanent tax code, which is very hard to crack open. Canada made some progress since the election of the Liberals federally in 2015, but they've run into a deep snarl in overseas grants and funding. The entire space is an ugly ball of tar-soaked yarn, with a history of oil and gas industry insiders shifting into governmental roles and back, creating line after line item for the industry. China has actually made more progress than most countries per external scorecards, which is one of the positive stories out of that country. But eliminating subsidies is cheap. You don't have to build megatons of new heavy industry to change where money flows. If you can crack the political nut, it has big upsides. Hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, are amazing chemicals. Cheap, easy to manufacture, great refrigerants. but they have global warming potentials up to 4,200 times that of CO2. The Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, that would be the ozone hole there, mandated that HFCs replace CFCs to save the ozone layer. Eliminating CFCs was accidentally good for climate change, as they are even stronger greenhouse gases than HFCs, which is saying something. But HFCs have to go. Thankfully, replacing refrigerants is pretty cheap. We have various alternatives. There are much lower warming potential HFCs, for example. HFOs show a lot of potential. And, ironically, CO2 is a pretty good refrigerant as well. It's possible to buy heat pumps that use CO2 today. Project Drawdown puts this at number 1 on its ranked list of solutions by cost versus benefit because it's so high impact for such low cost. The last time I checked, 131 countries, including China and India, had ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, the 2016 amendment that targets HFCs for replacement. Now, the US Senate still hasn't ratified it, but the tea leaves are promising. Ignore nuclear generation, including small modular reactors. That's empirical reality, observable, not an advocacy statement, by the way. This graph is from a study I did of China's nuclear, wind, and solar deployments from 2010 to 2021, a dozen years. The nuclear program was about 15 years into its efforts at that point, and wind and solar programs were about 5 years old. They were relatively equally mature efforts. And as you can see, wind and solar accelerated while nuclear stayed pretty flat. In absolute terawatt hours per year additions of energy, renewables beat nuclear hands down in the best possible conditions for nuclear, with wind and solar constrained capacity factors in the country accounted for. It is a clear natural experiment. Professor Bent Floevbjerg, the chair of major program management at Oxford, and an expert on infrastructure and energy project cost and schedule failures, is including this material in his upcoming book as a result. This doesn't mean we shouldn't keep existing nuclear running or that China should stop building more. It's just for the next 15 years we have to build an awful lot of low-carbon generation, and countries can't do that without a nationalized moonshot nuclear program that overrides local concerns and has an unlimited budget. Wind and solar are cheaper and faster to build, so we can build a lot more globally. And nuclear is mostly restricted to the 30 countries or so that already have it. There are 20 big hoops a country has to jump through with the International Atomic Energy Agency to build commercial nuclear generation. They include the big E of nuclear proliferation controls. They include about 7 layers of overlapping subsidized security for nuclear supply chain sites and waste, something the USA subsidizes to the tune of about $4 billion a year right now. They include getting the industry to fund the roughly $1 billion and century per gigawatt of nuclear capacity for decommissioning. They include national liability caps for private insurers, leaving the taxpayer on the hook for significant failures like Fukushima, which I project is going to cost $1 trillion US by the time all the costs are factored in. Wind, solar, water, transmission, and storage just don't have that kind of problem. Solar is already in every country in the world, and utility-scale wind is running in over 100 countries. Meanwhile, promised nuclear technologies, the new ones, including SMRs, are a couple of decades from commercial deployment at any scale, and have most of the same headaches as existing nuclear. I'm not against nuclear as a technology, it's just that if it has a place where it's the cheaper choice, it's in the last 5 to 20% of energy decarbonization, not the first 80%. The global market for carbon dioxide is a rounding error on our annual emissions, and the tiniest fraction of historical emissions. Virtually every CCS site is actually an enhanced oil recovery site which extracts oils that couldn't be pumped out before, typically enough that 2 to 3 times more CO2 is generated from the oil than was put underground. ExxonMobil claims to be a global and virtuous CCS leader, but that claim rests on the Chute Creek facility, which pumps CO2 up from underground in one place, pipes it to another place, and pumps it back underground to get more oil. Equinor's Sleipner facility is a North Sea natural gas well with too high a concentration of CO2, so they strip it off and shove it back underground for tax breaks And still, there are 25 times the emissions once the natural gas is burned. Expensive, unscalable, and wasteful. If we'd spent the same money that was spent on CCS over the past 40 years on wind and solar instead, even at the high costs of those technologies in previous decades, we'd have eliminated far more CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, flue carbon capture may be useful for cement and other very hard to decarbonize niches, but we have to restrict it just to those niches. Solutions such as carbon engineering's direct air capture with hydrogen electrolysis to create synthetic fuels are a broken model. I've looked at most air carbon capture technologies over the past dozen years. I spent time with Graciela Cichelniski, architect of the carbon market in the Kyoto Protocol, and her partner Peter Eisenberger, whose academic and professional career are equally stellar. They co-founded Global Thermostat, an air carbon capture firm which uses waste industrial heat from high CO2 consumers to run the very energy-intensive process of capturing and separating CO2 from the atmosphere so it can be used on site. It's a tiny niche play compared to the problem scale. I spent a remarkable amount of time looking at carbon engineering's direct air capture technology and worked up the costs and carbon debt of their promised plug-compatible fuels. With every benefit of the doubt given to their processes, including unrealistic efficiencies, dirt-cheap electricity, and low-carbon electricity, their solution would deliver fuel that was vastly more expensive and higher carbon than just using the electricity directly. And it's much more expensive and higher carbon than biofuels for hard-to-decarbonize segments such as deep-water shipping and long-haul aviation. Any money spent on this would have vastly better results if spent on renewables instead. I mean, it's not purely an either-or, but in this case, policymakers should ignore it and government shouldn't fund it. Power to X, yes, to displace fossil source chemicals required for industrial feedstocks, especially hydrogen. But direct air capture to power to fuel, that's a deeply inefficient and wasteful distraction. Hopefully I have time for a few questions, but regardless, the organizers will be happy to aggregate any questions you send them so that I can respond. And feel free to reach out at michael@tfie.io for more commercially sensitive discussions. Thank you. Take care.
Your last slide used the word, it made very, very damaging remarks about CCUS. About an hour ago, the chief energy officer in Colorado put CCUS up as a benefit. I totally agree with you that it's a nonsense idea, but I want the rest of the audience to know that Colorado is promoting CCUS.
Okay, and I think we can let this stand as a comment and go to another question.
So my question is, what about soil health in terms of sequestering carbon, things like using rock char and rock dust and biochar? Could you speak to that and its role in fighting the climate crisis?
If I understand the question is related to soil health and supplementation with biochar. Is that correct, Martin?
That's
okay,
right.
Good. Yeah. The fundamental question of biochar is scale. I haven't done the math on it, so I can't comment fully on it, but it looks promising in certain circumstances. Soil health with low tillage agriculture and preserving the undersurface biome is inherently more healthy than the current practices. I see a lot less erosion, see a lot more retention of biomass and organisms in the soil, and we see a lot less CO2 emissions. But I can't comment more than that.
When you consider you want to remove 1 part per million from the 420 down to 419 at $100 a ton, that's $800 billion to reduce 1 part per million using carbon capture. Do you have the moment to review those numbers and let us know what you think?
What I believe the assertion was that we have spent enormous amounts of money capturing very little CO2 using carbon capture and sequestration schemes. The specific numbers the audience member shared, I don't I can't comment on. But when I did an assessment a few years ago of all of Australia's efforts, I found that they'd spent $4,200 Australian for every ton of CO2 they'd sequestered. The majority of the best way to put it is that the only commercially viable carbon capture and sequestration schemes are ones that take CO2 out from underground in one place and put it back underground somewhere else for enhanced oil recovery or tax breaks. There hasn't been a successful bolt-on of carbon capture into a coal plant or other high-emitting site at this point.
Hey, Michael, my name is Alison Burchell, and I am doing loss and damage work with the United Nations. I'm also a geochemist, and Tracy, I can help with that question. My question to you, Michael, is spurred by the slide you had about really one of the most important things we can do is stop subsidizing fossil fuels. The United Nations and the Renewable Energy and Working Group committees, and I think you're probably aware of this, where I'm going is a request for some references, has said if we meet the 2030 deadline to bend the curve, and we can do that by stopping subsidizing the fossil fuel sector, and that gives us the 1.3 trillion we need to initiate global loss and damage solutions. Now, my question is, I'm working with the University of California, Berkeley, their research library. Do you have any references on how we can legitimately do that? Before your talk, we here in the community talked about how important legislation is. I'd like to pass that legislation. Thank you.
If I understand the question, my apologies if I get this wrong. The assertion was that the United Nations has said if we eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, we can hit 1.5 degrees. Second, and that's by 2030. Second is what references or citations around how we can move legislation forward on that can be done. I will say that for the United States, you have a very important election coming up in November. If you're not currently involved in Get Out the Vote organizing, please do so immediately. But other than that, I look around the world. My perspective is global. I completed a report recently on Northern African hydrogen projects intended for the EU. I've obviously looked at China a lot. I've looked at ASEAN. I've looked at Australia. The United States is, I'm just going to use that word exceptional, and I'm going to leave it there hanging.
Okay, I think that is a wonderful way to close out the session. And I would also recommend that people definitely go seek out Michael's interview with Bill Nussey, where he addressed many of these issues. And with that, Michael, thank you very much for agreeing to speak for us. And maybe in another world, we'll have you here at some point. Thank you.